안녕하세요. 이 세션을 기다리셨다고 하셨는데 기다리셨는지 잘 모르겠습니다. 근데 오늘 정말 중요한 날인 것 같아요. 특히 코로나 끝나고 이렇게 저희가 다 모여서 특히 그 세계 기아에 관련돼 가지고 이렇게 토론도 하고 그리고 발표 듣는 것은 굉장히 뜻깊은 자리인 것 같습니다. 제가 이 주최 측으로 들은 거는 저는 모더레이터를 한국말로 하고 그리고 대답하시는 이 패널리스트는 영어로 이제 답하는 걸로 이제 들었기 때문에 오디언스에 계신 여러 지금 학생들도 계실 것 같고 선생님들께서는 저희가 온라인으로 계속 질의를 받기 때문에 올려주시면 제가 그 중에서 꼭 필요한 것들을 뽑아서 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다. 특히 시간이 25분으로 제한되어 있어서 많은 것을 지금 토론하기는 어려울 것 같고요. 각 그 패널리스트 분들께 2가지 정도의 질문을 던지고요. 그리고 각 질문 하나에 답을 하실 때 3분 정도를 쓰시면 될 것 같습니다. 제 개인적으로는 오늘 이 세션의 키워드는 2가지인 것 같아요. 하나는 복합 위기다. 위기가 굉장히 복합적이고요. 그래서 글로벌 거버넌스가 거의 붕괴된 상태다. 그래서 이제 개별 국가로 돌아갈 수밖에 없는 그런 굉장히 어떻게 보면 예전에는 저희가 세계화라든가 글로벌 거버넌스를 위해서 뭔가 협력을 한다거나 이런 이제 단어나 그리고 의미들이 굉장히 지금 퇴색돼 있다라는 것. 그 얘기는 2번째 키워드로 넘어가는데요. 그래서 오늘 여러 이제 선생님들이 말씀하셨지만 going local. 이제 지역으로 가자는 것이죠. 그러니까 지역의 커뮤니티나 그리고 커뮤니티뿐만 있는 것이 아니라 젠더 이슈도 이제 연결이 됩니다. 그러니까 여성들을 어떻게 이제 현장으로 끌어내고 대우를 하고 인파워먼트를 시킬 것인가. 더 나아가서 이제 커뮤니티 베이스 디벨롭먼트라는 이제 개념들이 연결이 되고요. 마지막으로는 정말 그 아마티아 센이라는 분 다 아시겠지만 경제학자가 얘기한 퍼블릭 액션 그리고 디모크라시 이런 것들이 다 결국은 어카운터빌리티라고 하는 책무성 기제와 연결되기 때문에 크게는 복합 위기에 굉장히 글로벌 거버넌스가 붕괴되고 있는 상황이지만 로컬 단위에서의 협력을 어떻게 끌어내서 지금의 세계 기아를 끊어낼 수 있을까라는 논의가 굉장히 중요한 포인트로 오늘 얘기가 되어야 될 것 같습니다. 자, 그렇다면 그 시간이 많지 않은 관계로 제가 첫 번째 질문을 지금 오디언스에서 질문을 주셨는데요. 그 중에 굉장히 약간 매크로한 그 거시적인 질문부터 시작을 좀 해보겠습니다. 저 대사님께 그 앰베서더 윈트롭에게 먼저 질문을 던지겠습니다. 질문은 이렇습니다. 현재 세계 식량 시스템에 어떤 구조적 문제가 있는지 그리고 공정하고 지속 가능하며 회복력이 리질런트한 그런 식량 시스템 구축에 필수 요소가 있다면 무엇이 될까요? 라는 질문입니다. 그래서 요약하자면 지금 세계 식량 시스템의 구조적인 문제가 무엇이고 이것을 극복하고 굉장히 지속 가능한 방향으로 나가기 위해서는 어떤 식량 시스템의 필수 요건을 우리가 준비해야 되는가에 대한 질문입니다. 대사님 답변 부탁드립니다.
On my technology. Thank you so much. I think it's a big question to tackle in 3 minutes. I mean, a few thoughts really. I think we have fundamental weaknesses in markets, in food markets, both for outputs and for critical inputs such as seeds and fertilizer. And what that means in reality is that many farmers struggle to make ends meet. Farmers cannot produce and sell enough food to feed their families. We know how to fix these markets, but somehow we consistently lack political will to address that. There remains a problem, I think, of capacity at farmer level, in some cases capacity at local government level, at extension agent level, just to know what to do, just to know how to address the challenges of climate, to know how to fix markets, to know how to deal with collapsing ecosystems. And I think, you know, really investment in capacity building is a great bet. It's a great way to transform, to help hunger warriors to transform their own lives by just giving them a little bit of technical knowledge, a little bit of mentoring and some resources. And then lastly, you know, really with the impacts of climate change, we spoke earlier about dealing with shocks, but in many communities around the world, what you're seeing is wholesale ecosystem collapse. So, you know, soil nutrient collapse, an inability to manage water at local level, deforestation, pollination not happening. And really that we have to work with communities to try to reverse some of those trends, because otherwise the food system will fail to meet the nutrition needs of the 8 billion people that we have on the earth. So there are many other things I could point to, but I would say, you know, markets capacity and reversing the collapse in ecosystems would be my top 3 anyway. I hope that answers the question in part.
네, 감사합니다. 특히 저한테는 캐패시티 빌딩에 관련된 그 포인트가 싹 와닿는데, 저 캐패시티 빌딩 역량 강화를 사실상 지역 커뮤니티에서도 아니면 식량이 여러 가지 뭐 체인 앤 서플라이에서 어떻게 배치할 것이냐가 굉장히 중요한 화두가 될 수 있을 것 같습니다. 감사하고요. 자, 두 번째 질문으로 넘어가겠습니다. 두 번째 질문은 우리 WFP 윤선희 소장님께 여쭤보겠습니다. 이 또한 굉장히 큰 질문입니다. 분쟁, 기후변화, 그리고 자연재해 등으로 효과적인 지역 식량 거버넌스가 구축되기 어려운 환경이다라는 겁니다. 특히 취약국가 프레이저 스테이트나 인도적 위기 상황에 처해 있는 환경에서는 더더욱 어렵다는 얘기인데요. 특히 이제 식량 시스템 밖에 놓인 사람들은 어떻게 지원할 수 있는가? 그러니까 식량 시스템이라는 것이 붕괴되고 있지만 그럼에도 불구하고 그거 바깥에 있는 여러 이제 계층들이나 지역 주민들이 있을 텐데 어떻게 지원을 할 수 있는가? 그리고 하나 더 붙여서 질문을 연결하자면, 왜냐하면 질문이 너무 많이 지금 우리 소장님한테 왔기 때문에, 그 휴메니테리언 어시스턴스하고 WFP의 이제 주요 임무죠. 거기에 아까 그 발표하실 때 나왔던 내용이 뭐냐면 디벨롭먼트 프로젝트도 이제 한다는 겁니다. 그게 뭐 다양한 방식으로 아까 하신다고 얘기하셨는데, 그렇다면 휴메니테리언 어시스턴스하고 디벨롭먼트 프로젝트가 어떻게 연결이 돼서 식량 시스템을 바꿀 수 있고, 그리고 더 나아가서는 식량 시스템 밖에 있는 사람들을 지원할 수 있는가, 이런 질문들에 대해서 좀 답을 부탁드립니다. 3분입니다.
That was a much larger question. Let me do my best to answer that. Thank you very much, Professor. So, in 2 parts. The first question was really, well, they're related, because at the end of the day, and in the case of the World Food Programme, when it comes to humanitarian contexts and more stable development contexts, we believe that they shouldn't be treated in silos. Programs have to straddle both contexts, and I think here we will be very familiar with the term humanitarian development peace nexus. The word nexus really is at the core of what we do when we talk about building resilience. And building resilience can happen even in a humanitarian setting. So if we're talking about a context where food systems and strengthening food systems and approaching programs from a systems perspective is harder, or that governance structure isn't there, how do we assist those population groups? Well, I think there's a variety of things that we can do. I mean, in no specific order, and I mentioned this in my presentation, the distribution of cash, yeah? The distribution of cash has multiple positive impacts on the ground. It can stimulate markets, even very small market potential on the ground. It gives dignity through power of decision to beneficiaries. It allows local preferences and local commodities to be integrated into assistance programs. It gives a role to different value chain actors, including retailers, small shopkeepers, who are then part of a solution and can be part of a systems building approach. And organizations like the World Food Programme, by using these existing channels, can help actually put in place some kind of a structure and a system even if it's a very fragile or an initial one. By doing that, you can also harness homegrown opportunities. For instance, we have a refugee camp, and there's a school, and there are some homestead gardens, or there are some opportunities to integrate locally produced commodities in a program that is also being implemented within that community. This kind of homegrown or integrated programs can be very, very successful, even if it's at a very small scale, and it can also be replicated. At the core of all of this is what the World Food Programme believes to be critical. It's the engagement of communities. Community-based participatory approaches is so important because it's about getting the community's input and ownership from the beginning. They understand their context and their needs better than I. And this is where our partnership with NGOs is so important, because our NGO partners know their communities. And the World Food Programme also serves those who are furthest behind, and in those cases it's deep within communities. And so the participation of communities themselves is very important. So then when you talk about that, Professor, you have things like complaints and feedback mechanisms that are important in order to keep harnessing that feedback to make sure that your programs can provide protection, not protection in all sense of the word, for women, children, smallholder farmers, etc., etc. And then also through some of these programs, you allow complementary activities, other stakeholders to come and provide complementary assistance alongside yours, so that you have this enabling role. I think those are some of the ways that we would do what you mentioned.
뭐 질문도 좀 컸지만 대답도 굉장히 디테일하게 잘해주셔서 감사하다는 말씀드리고요. 시간이 자꾸 흘러가는데 시간을 좀 1시간 정도 잡아주셨으면 좋았을 뻔했다는 생각이 듭니다. 자, 다음 질문은 전 미스터 대쉬한테 이제 질문을 드리겠습니다. 대쉬 선생님한테 굉장히 질문이 많이 들어왔는데 두 가지를 먼저 합쳐서 질문 드릴게요. 첫 번째는 식량 시스템 변혁을 위한 로컬 거버넌스라는 단어 자체가 어렵다는 겁니다. 그래서 요거에 대한 설명을 조금 더 부탁을 드리고요. 더불어서 시민들이 적극적으로 식량권, right of food를 실제로 확보한 케이스가 있는지, 그런 사례가 있는지를 좀 설명 부탁드립니다.
Thank you, Professor Kim. I think I have briefly talked about it when going through my presentation, but at this question I would like to basically bring in a little bit of reflection on what could be a localized food system that we can address in this context. And a localized food system definitely is attributed to localization of the agricultural system in the geoclimatic context that people are living in. So what could be fitting in one part of the world may not be exactly fitting in the other part of the world, like I gave the example of partly Africa and partly Asia. Now in this context, a local governance system which is taking care of the food system, which has to have ownership of the local communities of the entire process that they need to deal with. At the same time, it has to be managed by the local people's organization and governed by themselves, so that they are actually owning the whole hem of affair that they need to take care. And it has to be perhaps enshrined by legislation to ensure that it is considered as a right. So that is where I think combining both the food system transformation and the local governance comes hand in hand together. And at the same time, the participation of the overall citizenry across the country or a nation that we are dealing with, and taking action, giving them the oversight, the right to seek accountability from their governments, that whatever has been legislated or guaranteed in the process of legislation is actually delivered on the ground, and people are able to ask for that accountability from their governance. And at the same time, bringing in a major player like private sector, those who are also playing a key role in fixing those food systems, ensuring that the markets are functioning, ensuring that the food is accessible and affordable to the community, those who are living in the brink of this crisis on a day-to-day basis. And the combined question, perhaps I will be able to address in the subsequent one, but at this point I would say Korea has been a brilliant example where coming out from a brink of the war to what we are today as a developed, self-sustained system in terms of the overall process, there's a lot to share with the world and contribute to the world so that other part of the world will also benefit from your experience. And that's where I would say that there's a greater role from our communities and members from this forum to contribute to this process. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 자꾸 시간이 아쉬운데 조금 더 제가 그 농도 있게 좀 질문을 다시 앰버서더 웬트럽한테 질문을 드리겠습니다. 지금 질문이 우리 대사님한테도 많은데요. 이걸 압축시켜서 조금 질문 드리자면 이런 얘기입니다. 코로나19 기후변화로 인해서 개도국의 식량 안보가 위협받고 있는데 지금 오늘 지역 로컬 거버넌스라든가 로컬 단위에서 어떻게 협력을 할 것인가를 논의하고 있는데 과연 그게 다인가? 로컬 단위에서 거버넌스가 혁신이 되고 코퍼레이션이 일어난다고 해서 과연 식량 문제가 해결될 것이냐? 그렇다면 정부의 역할은 뭐고 더 나아가서 정부들 간의 관계에서 어떤 대사님이시니까 그 인터내셔널한 차원에서 코퍼레이션을 어떻게 끌어낼 것인가. 예를 들어서 캅27 같은 경우에 이번에 로스 앤 데미지 펀드를 만들었거든요. 그래서 이런 식의 펀드를 만들 수 있는가라는 약간 큰 의미에서 국가의 역할 그리고 더 나아가서는 국가 간의 역할을 어떻게 보시는지 질문을 드리겠습니다.
I'm actually delighted you asked me that question. Look, if anybody in the room has ever studied the history of famine, the Irish famine, the Great Famine that happened in the 1840s, generates, to this day, I think, a lot of lessons. And there were two big lessons from the Irish famine that I think answers your question partially. The importance of a social compact between the citizen and the state is probably the single most important thing that prevents people from starving to death. And during the Irish potato famine, there was not that social compact. And as a result, you saw mass starvation. And I think really, so that's one thing, that kind of enshrined mutual acceptance that starving to death is not an acceptable outcome and that the right to food must be protected at all costs. The second thing is around accountability, but also transparent flow of information. So organizations like Concern and WFP have amazing early warning systems, but really you rely on local government to be able to ring that bell of alarm. And if you ever have time, I would encourage you to read a set of papers from the Irish famine called the Distress Papers, from a locality called Skibbereen. And it was very moving accounts of local officials writing to London at the time, saying, please help, this is what I am seeing every day. So that eyes on the ground to see what the physical manifestations of hunger looks like and know when to ring the alarm is really important. And I suppose that leads me to the second question. Those of us who are external, those of us who are development cooperation or humanitarian agencies, we can help, we can provide resources, sure we can save lives, but really if you don't have that social compact, you'll never achieve your goal. There is a message in this report, which nobody has mentioned actually, which I was really struck by reading it, which is that, of all of the awful situations that the report highlights, that in some contexts where war is raging and fragility is the defining characteristic, sometimes these little glimmers of optimism where local government has been able to provide that accountability and that early warning has been, something that agencies can work with as a starting point to put in place long-term solutions. On your second question around COP27 and loss and damage, I'm delighted to say the Irish government was central to the agreement on that fund. So I'm very, very proud of that. But again, you know, the resource requirement is there. We can write the checks, we can provide the support, but really we rely on the democratic institutions to effect change. Thank you.
감사합니다, 대사님. 그리고 다음은 우리 WFP 그 윤 소장님 차례인데 지금 제가 엄청나게 많은 것들이 올라오고 있어요, 질문이. 그 중에 좋아요도 누를 수 있네 보니까 질문마다 그 중에 가장 좋아요 숫자를 많이 받으신 분이 소장님이십니다. 그래서 그 질문을 드리겠습니다. 질문의 내용은 뭐냐면 소장님 발표하실 때 현금 지원, 캐시입니다. 캐시 서포트를 하는데 자율적으로 사용할 수 있도록 한다고 하셨습니다. 근데 현지인들에 대한 현금 지원에 한계가 있을 텐데 그 한계가 과연 무엇이고 현금 지원을 한다고 해서 뭐 지역에 있는 그 기아 문제가 해결될 것이냐, 그러니까 현금과 더 나아가서 어떤 거버넌스 펑션들이 같이 가야 되는지 그걸 조금 더 설명을 부탁한다는 질문이 가장 좋아요를 많이 받았습니다. 3분입니다.
My response will be quite quick. Thank you for that question. I think cash-based transfer has been around for a while, but it's really something that took a long time for practitioners to understand that it wasn't a dangerous modality. And in the case of the World Food Program, we're dispersing over $2 billion of cash every year in place of food assistance. Now, there's lots of studies and lots of mechanisms that show that when properly targeted, this is a very good way of providing assistance that has multiple effects on the ground. But it's also something that you know it requires different systems to providing bags of food, for instance. But one of the areas where I think opportunities for cash-based transfers, when it comes to engaging local governments or even community leaders or certain population groups, is the opportunities that it brings. For instance, a lot of the people who receive cash do not have ID cards, for instance, or they've never accessed financial services. They've never been able to open a bank account. They've never been able to access any loans or things like that. So just by exposure to this cash-based transfer or being able to get some kind of an electronic voucher where they can go and spend it at their will in ABC store, I think opens up a lot of opportunities, especially for women. I'm trying to remember what exactly the question was, but I think when it comes to cash-based transfers, it's not just an endless disbursement of cash. It's targeted, it's monitored, and it opens up a lot of opportunities. It builds businesses, it gives people livelihoods, it gives people choice, and it's not just food that they need. Everybody needs, uniform for their kids, or they need to be able to pay for a little bit for their electricity or fuel. So I think there's a lot that we have learned. There's a lot that we still need to learn, and I think there's a lot that we can do when we embrace these kinds of modalities together, and on its own can also build up a lot of systems and opportunities.
네, 소장님 말씀 들으니까 계속 저도 다음 질문들이 있는데 일단 시간이 1분밖에 안 남아서 마이크로 파이낸스랑 또 어떻게 다른지 아니면 모니터 하신다는데 모니터를 어떻게 하는지 뭐 디테일한 것들을 조금 알고 싶지만 시간이 좀 없어서 마지막 질문을 우리 미스터 다시에게 질문을 드리겠습니다. 질문은 이런 겁니다. 이것도 굉장히 좀 근본적인 문제인데요. 오늘 복합적인 문제를 해결하기 위해서 로컬 거버넌스를 얘기하고 있고 이게 키워드인데요. 과연 여기서 얘기하는 로컬이 무엇인가? 다시 말씀드리자면 시민사회나 지방정부라고 한다면 로컬이 아니면 로컬 커뮤니티라고 한다면 과연 우리가 믿을 수 있는가? 이들이 갖고 있는 커패시티가 만약에 지원했을 경우에 식량 위기를 해결할 만큼의 거버넌스 체제를 구축하고 있는가? 여기에 대해서 이제 질문을 하셨고요. 그거와 더불어서 아까 방글라데시 케이스를 말씀하셨는데 방글라데시 케이스를 요 질문에 한번 적용을 하셔가지고 답을 해주시면 어떨까 싶습니다.
Thank you, Professor. I think as the local governance as a concept which has been really a key factor of any democratic system that we live in. So when we talk about a local governance system, we are also talking about devolution of power and empowering the local community to be able to take action on their own crises and issues. And that is where the power should lie in terms of making a governance more effective, functional, and relevant to the current context. All the challenges that we are facing today is because of lack of those devolution and power becoming centralized in various contexts. And coming specifically to Bangladesh, where, as I mentioned, I have worked there extensively, you can see a very important and very interesting concept of handling disaster. And that is one of the brilliant examples of Bangladesh, where disaster mitigation or disaster risk reduction in Bangladesh could be taken as a case where the community volunteers led by the local governance system has been able to take action, provide early warning support, rescue communities or vulnerable people in the face of disaster, protecting their lives as well as livelihoods. Now, these are the cases where we have seen some functional, effective local governance system which has been delivering. But at the same time, I must acknowledge that they're not completely kind of brilliant in terms of functioning, because they do face a lot of challenges in terms of both authority to take decision, financing to support their own initiative at the local level, and the constraint that they face in terms of technology, which they deserve to have, but they do not. So those are the challenges perhaps need to be also considered from a concept that we talk about in global food system kind of assessment, where how much of this power is actually given to those communities by the constitution and by the legal mechanism that is going to empower the community in their legal rights. In those cases are also present across the world. Perhaps food rights have been hardly, if I remember, about 45 countries have enshrined it into as a food right in their national legislation. And very few, more, less than 35 has been really putting it into their systems and processes. Now that is where I think it's a big call from the Global Hunger Index report this year, where we need to perhaps strengthen those mechanisms to help those local governance systems and the local communities to be able to take that power in their hand and make some permanent and kind of long-term solution to their crisis. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 25분이 이미 지났고요. 또 그 다음 행사가 아마 하림 씨의 또 연주와 공연이 있을 것 같아서 이거보다 더 기다리시는 세션이 다음일 것 같습니다. 그래서 이렇게 정리를 할게요. 지금 오늘 25분밖에 못했기 때문에 이 세션 그대로 제가 약속을 드리는 거는 저희 국제대학원에서 다시 한번 하도록 하겠습니다. 다시 한번 이런 세션을 만들어서 다 오시고요. 그래서 이어서 토론을 계속하도록 하겠습니다. 자, 정리하자면 저는 political will 아니면 public action, civic engagement 이 단어들을 굉장히 좋아합니다. 그래서 우리가 뭔가 의지가 있으면 바꿀 수 있기 때문에 로컬 단위에서 하든 아니면 글로벌 단위에서 하든 이 논의가 계속 이어져야 된다는 거 굉장히 중요한 얘기들이기 때문에 계속 저희가 이어나가자는 말씀드리면서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사드리고요. 특히 세 분 오늘 너무 좋은 말씀해 주셔서 감사드립니다. 네, 그리고 박수로 정리하도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.